Yeah, it's wonderful. Yes, thank you so much to Sabina for the invitation. It's wonderful to meet you all and talk to you. I apologize for the confusing titles. I fortunately realized that I was getting 2 talks, not just 1 talk in advance today, because that is real nightmare material if you were to show up at this seminar not realizing that you needed to have slides. So this talk is going to be different from what we just had in the discussion. And I'm going to try and do a bigger picture story, thanks partly to talking with one of my collaborators, Steve Elliott, and sort of trying to figure out where things are headed. So Steve, when you watch this on the YouTube channel, I expect you to like it, leave a comment, positive comment in particular. But this is hopefully going to try and pull some threads together. And then there's a lot that's still very much in progress. So I think that different topics will speak to different people, and I look forward to having discussion after that. Real high level, what we're going to do here, I'm going to try and pose the driving question for my research, say a little bit about how I've developed an approach around that. I'm going to go briefly through several different projects that are partly sometimes finished, sometimes active, and then I'm going to spend more time talking about data commons and specific some of the work we've been doing on biodiversity data portals. Okay, and so as a starting point, I'm taking the view here that trying to aim at authoritative consensus is not going to be a sufficient ideal for our developing systems of knowledge that inform deliberative collective action. Think of climate change, biodiversity loss, of social justice. The idea that we're all going to first figure out what we agree on and then do something is not plausible here, right? Agreement is wonderful when we have it, but the idea that we're first going to deliberate and arrive at consensus and then act is not sufficient to get the work done. It's too urgent, it's too pressing, it's too pluralistic and or divergent. And so these sorts of global and also local challenges can't be solved this way. And one way to catch this out that I found very helpful is a contrast between tame problems and wicked problems that comes from this classic paper from Riddle and Weber, 1973. And the contrast here is sort of the things that you can study in your lab for as long as you want and muck around with without changing a thing out in the world and still staying relevant, right? So you can take an organism offline, study it for a while out of a population, and the population hasn't evolved so fast that whatever you were learning in the lab is now irrelevant. Or you're in physics, right? And it's the system, the fluid mechanics is going to be the fluid mechanics today, tomorrow, and forever. And moreover, the problem that you're addressing and what would count as a good solution are robust across perspectives. It doesn't matter what your values are or your metaphysical assumptions or other sorts of background commitments that you bring to bear in terms of defining what the research is supposed to be about and what it's supposed to address. And moreover, you can intervene and try things out without having lasting real world consequences. So these are nice tame problems. They're sort of what academia sold as its bill of goods for society, right? Give us your problems, we'll do the research, basic science, long-term science, and then we'll come back with answers. And increasingly, that sort of professionalization around tame problems is proving pretty frustrating. And I think it's partly because many of the problems that we actually are really trying to grapple with are wicked problems, right? And so contrasted, they're continuously changing, often non-linearly on different scales. So they're not necessarily stable enough for us to study for a long period of time in a lab setting or offline. They don't have a definitive formulation, right? When you think about what would count as social justice, you can come up with as many answers as you can, perspectives on what the root cause is and what the goal is of what does justice mean here. And similarly, action is urgent and has path-dependent consequences, right? So you try something out, the world is not the same after that. You can't necessarily reverse course and come back to where you were. You then have changed things and need to deal with that. And so these sorts of wicked problems pose interesting challenges for how we make knowledge. And just to give a somewhat more concrete example, with global biodiversity loss, right, the species are going extinct. Even the most abundant species are declining in their populations at a really dramatic rate. The total insect population in these different groups has declined 41% over the past decade, according to this recent study. So things are dramatic, right? They're urgent. They're quite across the board. Clearly, the knowledge is playing a role here, but then what do we do about it, right? And so why do we care about this? Some people care because biodiversity is intrinsically valuable. The species have their own worth. Some care about what the species do for us, and extrinsic value, or some don't care at all, right? Lots of people out there have very tangential relationship to the value of biodiversity. What do we do about it, right? Should we be conserving more habitat? Should we be re-engineering markets? Should we be imposing more government regulation on industries? All of these different solutions are going to depend partly on how you frame the issue. Should we be acting radically right now, trying to achieve some kind of gradual change of course, or just let it be, it doesn't need intervention in the first place? And then who is really responsible, should be taking the lead or the burden of the efforts here, right? And so this sort of illustrates the wickedness of the problem, perspectival, divergent, urgent, but also rapidly changing nature of it. And so in thinking about biodiversity loss, or your favorite problem, the driving question for my work is what knowledge do we need to get things done together while still differing in fundamental ways? Right? How do we make knowledge happen in a way that lets us act on these urgent problems without presupposing that first we're going to agree on the most important issues before something happens? And I realize in a philosophy audience, fundamental is a tricky word. I don't mean it I mean it in a very pragmatic or practical sense, right? Something that's very important, like how we understand morals or the good, but that's very hard to reconcile in practice. Think about intrinsic versus extrinsic value of species, right? Very deep disputes, people have their views. Those are important for how they motivate and act and what they want to know, but we're not going to reconcile it anytime soon in the future. Okay, and so there's the driving question: what knowledge do we need to get things done together while still differing in fundamental ways? That's a big question and a pretty abstract one. So how do we break that down a little bit? And here the approach that I'm taking is to think of knowledge systems as social technical heuristics. Let me unpack that. I really take inspiration from Susan Lee Stark here, who is a famous science and technology studies scholar. You might know her from boundary objects or infrastructure or studies of taxonomy classification. She has this paper, which I'm a fan of, is almost like the alternative history of what boundary objects might have been, the structure of ill-structured solutions from 1989. And part of what she poses there is a different way of thinking about what our computer systems are supposed to be doing for us. And so instead of a Turing test, where we somehow expect a computer to be this individual, like stand in for an individual person and act like a human in this one-on-one interaction, she's pushing for this social metaphor of a Durkheim test for computational intelligence. That is, that systems should be tested with respect to their ability to meet community goals. And so when she's thinking about what is an adequate computational system for the problems of our communities, she's thinking in a real-time design, acceptance, use, and modification of a system by a community sense. So this is to place the challenges for our knowledge systems in their increasingly digital and computational mode in a firmly social setting. Right? It's not just the technology in isolation, some kind of cognitive test in the vat, but it's really about putting it into action with people in a social setting. And so one way of unpacking that in biodiversity is to think about how do we get from the primary biodiversity data sources, like different data sets or databases that people have created, to decision making, right? And we've got this kind of common multi-layered step here where first you got to put the data together, aggregate it and integrate it so that it's really ready for modeling use. You generate predictive models to try and inform the risks and interventions and decision making. But then you've got to understand how to turn the models into things that actually matter for the people in charge, right? For the people who have a say about what should be done. And then it's not a one-way street. It has to be coming back too. We have to think about, well, what are the societal parameters that the models should take into account? How do we, if we know that we're trying to make certain models, how do we figure out what the data is that we need to inform those models? And then what data should we be gathering and which data is important in the first place, right? Based on what the models are trying to do. And so it's supposed, ideally, right, this kind of feedback loop of knowledge, data, modeling and analysis, informing sort of the scenarios or choices involved in decision making, and back. And in thinking about how do we get knowledge into a place where it can complete this kind of feedback loop and give us worthwhile information to make better decisions, I turned partly to Bill Wimsatt and thinking about how to analyze them and re-engineer them. And so here I'm drawing on Bill's emphasis on heuristics that always have systematic failure conditions, right? Instead of hoping for any kind of perfect form of knowledge or method, everything is heuristics all the way down. And so with any heuristic, the sort of background is that it's going to fail under certain conditions. And it's helpful to try and figure out when and why, and whether or not you're in the right condition for that heuristic, right? Or maybe you need something different. And so in taking different approaches to putting the loop together with computational infrastructure and methods, we want to analyze the robustness of the heuristics that are in play in those knowledge systems, define their assumptions, and then when we see where they have real limitations or flaws for the context we're in, to try and metabolize that into better methods, right? Or say, oh, we should really be trying something else here, right? Go for different alternatives. And in applying this sort of critical toolkit, the setup here in my work, which is quite interdisciplinary, going between history and philosophy and science, is to sort of start by figuring out what are the assumptions at play here, right? So think historically and philosophically to clarify and critique those assumptions, try and tease apart how the wicked problems are being structured and institutionalized, and then look at the assumptions and ideals behind those institutional forms in order to unpack what are their systematic failure conditions, what might be useful alternatives or improvements you could make. And when I sort of get to that stage, I start to look for collaboration, right? And so a lot of the projects I'll talk about here are collaborations with mathematical biologists, evolution biologists, and data scientists. And so one of the questions is always, is the alternative actually better, right? You need to put some data behind that. And then can you actually do it, right? And so it's nice to talk about pluralism in the abstract. It often feels very easy because you've reconciled everything. But when you try and put the rubber to the road, can you make it work, right? Without expecting another $100 million to come your way out of the thin air. Okay, so there is a driving question and the sort of high level approach. What I'm going to go through is several examples of recent projects and some of the upshots there. And then I'll, at the end, go deeper into data commons. And so part of what I'm doing in these projects is breaking down this bigger picture into some component parts. Sort of different aspects of a knowledge system and what does it mean for them to be suitable for addressing wicked problems. So terminology, right? What's the scientific jargon or language? How is it defined? Closely related to, but different from classifications. Classifications are more like systematic ways of carving apart a domain of things. They will have terms, but not everything is a classification. Statistical analyses, where we're sort of at this modeling level, right? Which model is best for predicting or answering the questions that we have. And then the last one that I go into in more depth is the databases. How do we configure and govern databases in a way that best suits the perspectival and contested nature of the problems? Okay. So one project that wrapped up recently, but of course has loose threads left, as everything does, was interested in this idea of ambiguity in scientific language. And so there's often an assumption, I just saw a paper come out yesterday, that really the problem here is that we haven't formalized the language of science enough so that it's not clear and precise. And that's why we have all of these problems getting information out of scientific articles. Literally like perfect paper, yesterday about how we should formalize biodiversity research in order to avoid ambiguity. But in fact, ambiguous language can be productive for communication and coordinated action in several different ways. And I think one of the ways that's most overlooked, but that cognitive linguistics has unpacked, is actually it can be more efficient cognitively for humans to have ambiguity. And this is just a sort of figure here, but what it's showing is that for a certain set of syllables in a word, and the number of different meanings assigned to that same sound, So like the word to, going to somewhere, and the number two, right? It's a homophone here, two different meanings for the same sound. The shorter the word, the more different meanings it has. And that's partly because using shorter words is cognitively easier, right? Easier to say, easier to parse. And so they get overloaded with more meanings because if there's sufficient context to figure out whether I'm talking about going to the bank or I want $2 from the bank, you're fine. You figured out what I meant. You don't need two separate words for those two different, those two different meanings in the same sound. And so we don't have to have this ginormous list of a different word for every possible meaning that we could ever have. Instead, we can overload the easy words and be able to communicate more efficiently as long as the context is sufficient. So taking sort of for granted here that there are productive forms of ambiguity, I'll say more about that in the next slide. What are the implications for engineering standards and standards? And so let me unpack the different notions of ambiguity. And I'm really, in this project, we're focusing in on polysemy in the sense of multiple meanings for a single term. So not so much vagueness, for example. And the idea is when you're looking at a text, in this case, and you have the author, there's sort of different forms of context around a term that appears in the text that has more than one possible meaning. There's a linguistic context of what occurs upstream and downstream in the text. There's also the social context of where it was written, what else is known as the background about the author and the discourse, et cetera, that the audience can draw upon. And then different possible outcomes, right? So if the context is absent, you might just end up being confused. You might arrive at the incorrect meaning. And this is sort of the case where people think, oh, we need to get rid of ambiguity because it always leads to error, right? But as I was just describing with the Piadosi paper, if there's enough context in the background, if you know what I'm talking about, even though I used an ambiguous word, you can figure out what the correct meaning is, then you're fine, right? And we can actually communicate more efficiently by taking context for granted. A different use of ambiguity is called strategic in the social science literature. So, and you can think about politicians here speaking to multiple audiences with the same speech, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in a insincere way, right? You can, in fact, biodiversity is a good example of a word like that, where the point is to get things done. We don't all have to agree on exactly what biodiversity is. We might have different meanings for it, but we're all broadly behind what we're up to here, which is trying to protect roughly something about the number of species or genetics or phylogenetic lineages, et cetera, involved. And the last sense is a kind of generative use of polysemy, where we kind of bring in metaphor here. So I can use a word metaphorically in a way that doesn't reflect any established meaning, but if there's sufficient context behind it, you and I can sort of arrive at a shared meaning on the fly. Right? I can sort of figure out, oh, when he's talking about the brain being a computer, I can figure out that he's really talking about a kind of distributed network processing in this context. Okay, so here are 4 different types of polysemy, or productive, or polysemy, and 3 of them are productive priority. 1 for efficiency reasons, 1 because you can speak to different audiences, each of which finds its own local interpretation, but nonetheless the job gets done, and 1 that's productive in a generative way, right? It introduces new meanings into language. And this is coming from a recent paper in Synthesis. And then the sciencey bit of this is, well, trying to think about the conditions under which ambiguity can be productive. And so obviously, in each of those cases, you can only figure out the right meaning or get the job done if there's the right shared context. And if the context is missing, then we just get confusion or error. Well, context is dependent on who's there and it being stable, what background knowledge they have, how much training they've received, whether they've seen these words before, and so forth. And so one thing that we started to do in the project, and someday I hope to take to completion, it's the loose thread, is try and track the usage of words or terms that overlap in their meanings, but some of them are more ambiguous than others. And so, for example, this term T3 here would have two meanings. T1 has the first meaning, but not the second. And the second, and T2 here has the second meaning, but not the first. So T3 is more ambiguous in the sense that it has multiple possible meanings in either of these. And we can ask, well, in a given discourse, do we see as more people show up, right? Or there's a lot of turnover in the composition of the community that they start to use more precise terms, right? That only have a single meaning. Or when the community is stable and presupposes a strong amount of background, do they prefer T3 if it's a shorter, easier word, right? Basically for efficiency reasons. And so you can track that by counting the instances of the terms and then looking at their substitution in similar contexts. And I think this is partly waiting on a great use case where we actually want to bother figuring out trends in ambiguous language. So if you have that, I'd love to talk about it. Biodiversity might be fun, but I'm not sure what the end goal would be. Okay, so on to the second project, thinking about classifications. Conservationists often complain about taxonomists being this anarchic group of cats running around changing their minds about what species exist in the world every other year. And then there was this sort of notorious paper by Garner and Christidis in, I forget if it was Science of Nature. Taxonomic anarchy hampers conservation. What is the solution? Well, there's now a group that's pushing for a global consensus classification. One list of species to rule them all. They sort of have very complicated ideas about how that consensus would be developed. But as you might guess, I'm interested in alternatives and whether or not that consensus approach is really going to fit the bill. And so in a paper with Nico Franz and Yuri Witteveen a couple of years ago, we tried to think about what are the alternatives to consensus classification as an approach. And the core distinction we came up with was not a kind of first order, we agree on the same set of categories to use in forming our beliefs in all cases, but a coordinated consensus where we agree on how to disagree, right? So we have a stable way of disagreeing so that I can map your categories onto my categories, but I'm not adopting your categories, right? And you're not adopting mine. We can still communicate, we can still exchange information and get things done together, but not by converging on one universal classification. And so there's different ways of sort of unpacking how you might justify these approaches and the sort of assumptions they make, right? Sabina will know well with Barry Smith and Werner Koisters, they have the ontological realism sort of basis for all of these data classifications, where they're saying, well, why are we going to all agree? Because there's some kind of consensus about what's really out there. Our categories are just the real things in the world. And so, yeah, I mean, that's nice if you all have high agreement about what those terms mean and how they should be applied, right? But in many cases, we don't have that level of certainty and we still need to communicate and get things done together. So maybe you'll point to something more like, I don't know what they are, but I know how to measure them, right? Have more of an epistemic approach. And some biologists have done that in the context of trait anatomy or anatomy traits and ontologies, where ideally they would be, all of the traits would be homologies, but they don't really know what's evolutionarily related to what. And so instead they're just going to say, yeah, well, I know how to distinguish this structurally, that this is vertebrate 1 and this is vertebrate 2. I don't know if these are evolutionarily homologous or what, but I know how to measure them. And so that can give you a kind of epistemic consensus. But in the case of species lists and species classification, we don't have some kind of epistemic consensus about how to delimit species. But as long as we are explicit enough about what our categories mean, applying it correctly or incorrectly can be robust, right? I can know whether I apply your meaning correctly or incorrectly, even if I don't agree with your meaning. And in that sense, we just need to know how to map the meanings of our terms across to each other and be able to apply them correctly in order to communicate robustly. And so what does that look like if you try and implement it? Well, one of the projects I'm working on right now with Nico and computer scientist Jonathan Rees is to try and scale the sort of alignments that you would need to do that kind of mapping of coordinated consensus in practice. And so Jonathan has really taken the leap forward here of using information contained in the names and the hierarchies of the taxonomic classifications to track how basically the synonyms or the type specimens are being shuffled around from one version to the next, and be able to align the meaning of, for example, this species in the mammal species of the world to two other meanings, or really three, based on how their synonyms are related from one list to the next. So this is hopefully going to scale to the level of aligning all the different species used in biodiversity data. And then there's also a question of, well, this is great at the level of the categories, but what about when you've got data, let's say in this one, and you're trying to figure out, okay, I've got a data record here, should I put it in this one, that one, or this one, right? Because if I'm carving up the meaning of this into these three subgroups, it's ambiguous which one this record should travel with. And so with another biologist, Nate Upham, and a grad student, Caleb Powell, we've been working on how to use information in the records themselves to try and disambiguate them. And so this is an example with the species Peromyscus maniculatus that has something like 250,000 records in the global database, and was in 2019 split into 5 species. So before 2019, Peromyscus maniculatus had the range that covered all of North America. And then in 2019, biologists came along and said, actually, there's going to be 5 different species shown in the different colors here, and now maniculatus is just this east of the Mississippi. So now we've got 250,000 records. We don't know where to put them, right? Because basically all we have is that the name maniculatus, but now that can be 5 different species. And so what we can do here is partly use expert range maps of the new species, and then some machine learning methods around the edges here where we're not sure where a record falls in particular. And what this gives us is on the outset, or on the output, new computational re-identifications of all of the species observations. So we can disambiguate the 250,000 records in a way that lets us keep the taxonomic, or move the data under the new taxonomic classification while preserving their accuracy. Okay. And then the third project, before I get more into the data commons stuff, is digging deeper into how we model evolutionary processes under context of changing climate. Right? So speaking of what can we learn from evolutionary history to speak to what's going to happen to us in climate change. And the core issue here is the historical data, and mainly thinking about fossil records here, is limited compared to the complexity of the process, obviously, right? Not only are there the lineages themselves that are evolving, there's all of the things going on in the environment, both abiotic and biotic, of which we only know a small fraction. And in this sort of setting, statistical assumptions can make a really big difference, what you find. And so this is just to illustrate some of the data that we're working with, where these are fossil plankton. The shells are known as foraminifera. And you can see that got some basic traits here of width and height, and like the surface area versus the aspect ratio, and 2 different lineages preserved in the fossil record. And so this one ended up going extinct at the end of the period looked at, and this one continues to exist today. And so is there something going on in these different patterns of how their traits are evolving that can give us a clue about what caused the extinction? It's kind of the root scientific question. And part of the challenge here is, and building off of a paper from 2021 with Scott Ligard, is that how we analyze the evidence for the models, unfortunately, depends on how adequate we think the models are to the true process. And so thinking about the adequacy of our candidate models to the true process, I'm going to call a metaphysical assumption here. There's nothing super deep meant by metaphysical, but I'm happy to talk about it. And the upshot is that you can have the same data, exactly the same observations, trait information, right, what I'm showing here, and exactly the same candidate models, but arrive at different conclusions about what process you're looking at. And the issue is that as you move from thinking that your models are totally adequate, you've actually got the true process in your model set, all the way down to, yeah, our models are so inadequate, you could have an infinite series of them and they'd never get close to the truth. You quantify the evidence for the best model in different ways. And so the underlying assumptions translate into different statistical techniques for quantifying evidence that can lead to disagreements about what the data is telling you. And this forms a kind of underdetermination that we talk about in the paper. And here, the approach that I'm interested in is, you might think, okay, the solution is to get rid of, these guys, right? If only we were here, we'd be fine. But as you might suspect, right, along with the realism, anti-realism debate, our chances of eliminating these options and arriving at one of them is quite small, I would suggest. So let's go the other direction. Let's have more methods to try and triangulate what the sources of disagreement are. At least we can get clear about why we're having different results, and then try and decide if one of those approaches can be better justified. I can say more about that if you're interested. And so part of what we're doing in the project is bringing a generalized new algorithm into play for doing Neyman Pearson testing without being restricted to two models and a kind of null hypothesis. So if you think about the kind of classic, did my drug have a statistically significant effect? Well, the null hypothesis is that the mean is 0, and then you're looking whether or not the estimated mean on your alternative is statistically far from 0. That's fine if you only want to compare two models at a time, and one of them is clearly the one you don't care about. But in the evolutionary modeling setup, we care about all the different patterns that a lineage might show. And one of them is not clearly the uninteresting or the simplest one. And so this is just some recent very simple data showing how we're able to control the error rate at the specified 0.15 level. And then as the evidence gets better, an important step forward on the Neyman Pearson setup is that the error rate actually continues to improve as the evidence gets stronger. And so we don't just get stuck at the same level of mistakes, even as we increase the sample size asymptotically. We actually can pick up on that and go down to 0 when the evidence supports it. So this is bringing a way in of actually controlling what the errors are in making our model choices that are not available in many of the current practices that evolutionary biologists are applying. I can also say more about it if you're interested. Okay, so just to sum up, right, what I've done is broken down this big issue of knowledge systems for wicked problems into some subcomponents and looked at the assumptions involved in each of them. What are the conditions under which they might fail systematically, and are there alternatives that we can either analyze to see if they're better or trying to implement. And we've gone through the terminology, classifications, and statistical analysis one. Now I'm going to go to the databases. Let's see. Oh, am I on time?
Yeah, I mean, I would want to very much we won't touch it, but 15, 20 minutes.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. I set up my time tracker and then my phone logged me out. Okay, so this is very much a project in progress with my co-PI Zoe Nissa and Steve Elliott, and a postdoc, Uta Brady. Zoe is at Purdue. Steve is now at NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. I always use the last word there. And Uta did her PhD studying the rules and institutions involved in conservation treaties to try and understand their robustness as sort of methods for preserving biodiversity. And she's sort of bringing that approach to what we're studying with the data portals now. And the core focus of the project is looking at what's now about 50 portals using this Symbiota software platform that's been developed at ASU and is partly what we're leveraging access to in the project. The portals collectively host over 70 million species observation records and covering something like 1,400 different collections, so different units and specimens at different museums or institutions, and has thousands of active users. So it's really one of the largest and most active settings for people digitizing, curating, and using biodiversity data. What's really nice about the Symbiota platform is that there's enough portals here, about 50, where they have the software in common, even as they differ in many other ways, like the community, the type of data they're interested in, how long they've been around, their funding, we can compare them meaningfully to try and arrive at large, like explanatory understandings of what might explain variations in their outcomes. And so we don't have to do a single case study. We're also not like going so big that we can only have a quantitative understanding of what's going on. We actually can, planning to interview people at all of these portals and then have a kind of mixed methods approach of combining and looking at the backend database, the usage analytics, the interviews, and hopefully some survey data. Okay, so let me now, before I get into that too much further, back up and just say what is biodiversity data, as I'm understanding it. And so really what I'm talking about are observations of an organism at a place in time. So it's what we call a species occurrence record. And so, for example, Bernard Dupont in 2008 saw this javelina in Central America, took a photo of it, and then posted it on the iNaturalist app. You can look at his photo and record here at this URL. And then because it had a photo attached and some other people looked at it and confirmed that it is indeed a javelina, it would get pushed out to this other data aggregator called the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, which is sort of the largest global collection and portal for accessing biodiversity information. And what does the record really look like? It's going to be hard to see right here, but basically a bunch of fields with information about where, when, what, and who, right, took the record. And so in everything that follows, I'm sort of assuming that a record or a particular observation you can understand as having this sort of form. And then you might be thinking, oh goodness, data portals, how boring, aren't they just websites, right? Like what's so interesting here? And this is where we really need to go back and think about them as both social and technical pieces of the system. Because these portals don't just happen on their own. It's not like someone pushes a button and then the website stands up and it works. There are, as I mentioned, thousands of people working to keep these online, add new information, maintain the quality of information, and ensure their sort of appropriate use. And so when I talk about a portal, I have not just the data records in mind, but also an organization of people with different roles and responsibilities behind it, the community, and then the governance institutions that set rules, maintain accountability and responsibility and so forth. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of some early work to try and figure out what are the factors we should be paying attention to understand the differential outcomes of these portals. We got lots of data of all lots of different kinds. What are the right variables, right? Are the right configurations you should be focusing on? And so I'm going to be contrasting some of these different data portals, GBIF, GenBank, which is sort of the main repository for genetic sequences. Symbiota, I'm just going to take as a lump here of different data portals, and the iNaturalist Citizen Science app. And in each of these cases, the key idea here is that what makes a data portal, what sort of individuates it and makes it worthwhile at the simplest level, is that behind it is a pooled shared resource of data records in one place that you can access. And so in the background, I'm going to have this concept of data pooling, which for those of you that were here for the discussion earlier is not familiar. And so pooling data is a process that involves not just epistemic stuff about putting your data together in a standardized way to make it useful, but also providing the infrastructure required to manage and give access to that information, and then governing the resource for the benefit of a community of users beyond a single research project or lab. So you're making something that's supposed to last, supposed to be used by more people than just the ones directly involved in populating the database and maintaining it. So, with a Symbiota data portal, you can think they're often set up to be multi-institutional collaborations where they're pooling digitized specimen records held in their different collections across the US or internationally into the same database that you can access under a single search bar and also edit and curate on the website. And The question then is, if we're sort of taking for granted that the goal here is to pool data into some kind of useful resource, and then there's the question of, how should we do that? That in a way that will best suit the things that people want to do with biodiversity data. There are some different options that we can consider. And I've given some food analogies here to help bring this home. So we might have a kind of off-the-shelf product mode, which is a lot like GBIF, where the data is sort of already prepackaged in a standardized way, and you just go pick it up and then use it as you want to. It might be something more like an assemble on demand, like Chipotle, right? Where you show up and they say, well, I've got these 5 bins of food. You can tell me what you want me to put in your burrito, but it's got to be from these 5 bins of food, right? That's kind of like a search index portal where it's sitting on top of a bunch of different things. You can access all of those different things under a single interface, but you only get back whatever is underneath it from those 5 resources. You might have a more customized approach. And so many NGO conservation contractors or consultancies have this sort of mode where they'll say, okay, what's the decision you want to make? I will build you a data resource for that decision, sort of customized to spec. The Symbiota data portals are more of the pure data commons, where there's not a single client that's driving the research, but more many different lateral contributors that are mostly on a horizontal sort of power relationship that are contributing as peers to a single shared resource managed in the public domain. And then we're all familiar with a bunch of custom databases where someone said, I want to know all of the viruses in bats. And so I'm going to build a special database that updates every night from the GenBank and other APIs, right? And that's my custom database for bat viruses. And these differ in terms of how standardized they are in terms of the infrastructure, which is driven partly by their scale and how much pre-processing they do to deliver the off-the-shelf or on-demand services. And in contrast, how much customization to a given client or use case they're making in producing their data and how they pool. I'm just going to sort of touch on this briefly. But then for each of these different models, you can think, okay, well, let's say this is what I'm trying to do, but where am I really headed with this? Which option should I be pursuing as I try and get to some kind of useful service down the road? Maybe I'm trying to build something where for a given set of domain of data, such as biodiversity, species occurrence records, right? I might carve that up by taxonomic group and then put it all into one big database and have a single website like GBIF where you can access that under a single list of accepted species in backbone taxonomy. Or you might try and have a model where each taxonomic community has a different database, but they all are organized so that they carve up the data into distinct non-overlapping domains based on, this might be mammals, this might be birds, this might be insects, et cetera. And in following that shared hierarchy and standardized taxonomy, they can service a shared or a single comprehensive access point. Both of these have a kind of unified structure to them where there's only one data pool in charge of a given data record at a time, and there's a single standardized taxonomy applied to all of the records. When we look at the Symbiota data portals, they don't really follow this structure. They're doing something interesting that's a little bit different, where they're sharing data with each other, but they're also maintaining their independent species lists. They often overlap in their domains, but have different focuses. Some might be interested in southeastern plants in the US, some might be interested in North American trees, and some might be interested in ectoparasites and mammals, right? And so lateral exchange between overlapping domains, these portals might manage the same records nominally independently and adopt different taxonomic lists while still trying to maintain coherence and communication. This is where the taxonomic alignment comes back in that I was talking about earlier. How do you actually make this work, right? And then the option that doesn't really speak to the scientific community at this point is having a bunch of uncoordinated fragmented databases that are not interoperable and are not don't have similar standards or really a capacity to communicate with each other. And so might even be talking about the same things, like in this case, but can't learn from each other because they can't share information. What's helpful about thinking about data pooling here, and then the regulative ideals that we would pursue to shape and manage those pools, is to give us a sort of high-level theoretical lens to think about these different databases and compare them, right? To try and theorize about them in a comparable way. And so in the background, in the project, we're really trying to theorize and conceptualize these pooled data resources as commons. And the point of a commons approach here is to analyze collective action or social dilemmas in instances where individual decision-making can undermine the public good. So someone wants to go one way, but that might actually make it worse for everyone else. How do we try and ensure that we're all sort of headed in the same direction, roughly speaking, without having a top-down authority that tells us all what to do necessarily? And so the focus is on, what are the institutional arrangements, what are the norms, what are the rules or other sorts of governance mechanisms in play that shape the actions that people take. And when I talk about commons, there's sort of a colloquial sense of the word where we talk about, the biodiversity commons, blah, blah, blah. This is really coming out of a specific theoretical approach from Eleanor Ostrom's work, but I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into that deeper. We can talk more about that. And so just to sort of flag here that if you don't care about institutions or institutional analysis, if you're really about following the people and their informal networks, this was probably not going to speak to you, or at least be tangential at best. There's an interesting gap in the commons literature of work addressing justice, equity, and sovereignty. And that's something that hopefully we'll get to talk more about in the future years. And not everything is a collective action though. Sometimes it's totally fine that markets work as they're expected, right? So one of the things that Uda is bringing to the project is a tool or method for analyzing the rules stipulated for different commons. It's currently known as the institutional grammar. And in her context of working with conservation treaties, right, they say a member of the treaty shall do blank, or must do blank, or is permitted to do blank. And you can kind of break that down into deontic rules and then ask how coherent those rules are and whether they're really robust to the setting. And so Uda is sort of helping us work out what that looks like for the governance of data commons, these pooled data resources. In some cases, these rules are embedded in the software, right? What are the permissions given to different user settings? Like, are you an editor, a manager, a super user, et cetera? In some cases, they're set in the documentation on the website for the portal, or in other cases might be quite informal and just sort of understood but acted upon. And so this is by way of setting up, trying to uncover those factors or configurations that help us understand the outcomes of portals. This framework is from the Commons literature. It's known as the Institutional Analysis and Development Framework. It might look deeper than it is, but it's basically a way of ensuring we describe different instances of commons in a comparable way. And so it sort of helps to carve up what's going on into these different units of aspects. And so what I'm going to be focusing on today is mainly the action situations of people editing or otherwise changing the contents of the database, what I'll call the producers. You could also think about users here or other groups. And then I'm going to be focusing on what we think are some really important or salient features of the pooled data resources in a biophysical material sense. What are the things connected to the records in the database, and how do their properties matter to what people do as they're changing the contents of the records? And we're going to sort of end with formulating some new hypotheses about the institution, like the rules or incentives that are going to matter here for the sustainability of a database. So this is sort of where getting clear on the conceptualization up front is going to take us to new scientific, in this case, social scientific questions. Okay, So what I want to do to start is distinguish between user and producer perspectives on biodiversity data resources. So same records in a data portal, but depending on what you're hoping to do with them, the actions you're looking to take with respect to those records, the resource appears and acts in different ways for you. So we're going to think about what are the action situations for producers as opposed to users here. And just as background, thinking about the Symbiota portals, these portals operate as commons because they put their data into the public domain, and digital data in particular are not rivalrous in their use. If you download a data set and I download the data set, we're not both prevented, we don't prevent each other from using the data set. In contrast to something like if I check a book out from the library, you can't check it out, you have to recall it, right? So we're competing for access to the book or competing for access to the water, which is especially appropriate in the Southwest right now. And so we're honing in on cases where it's hard to exclude people from using the resources, the digital data, and there's relatively little subtraction from one person's use when the next person comes along to access it. But we can think about this not just from a use perspective, which is sort of the common one, where we're talking about who has the rights to access the resource, who has the rights to withdraw or otherwise consume the resource. We can also think about it from the producer view. Who has the rights to edit it? Who has the rights to add to the resource? Who has the right to verify or otherwise confirm the quality of the resource? And this is particularly appropriate for knowledge commons as socially constructed resources, as opposed to natural resource commons like water or forest, which at least is in principle self-generating, right? Did not come about through human construction. And so one of the things that we're interested in here is whether or not the rights to edit a record in the database is restricted to the same person who created them. And let me unpack that a little bit more. So in the case of GenBank, any scientist, and as far as I can tell, pretty much anyone that makes up a genetic sequence can submit a record to GenBank. I'm not clear what quality filters they actually have in place, but they don't restrict submissions on the front end. So there's quite broad rights for someone to submit to GenBank, but only the person who submitted a record is allowed to come back and edit it. There could be the most horrific typo in the species name, and you could see it, and there's nothing you can do about it other than to contact the original contributor and say, please fix this. And then, probably in most cases, they'll just ignore you. In the case of GBIF, and we'll say more about this, you have to be part of the right organization, of a certain kind of organization to add records, and only members of those organizations that are providing data to GBIF, again, have the authority to edit them. But in Symbiota, and also in iNaturalist, people are by design able to come to records that others contributed and make changes to them. They're reconfirming taxonomic identification, they're adding new measurements, they're cleaning up the geolocation information. And so Symbiota, you have to have the right, you sort of have to have permissions to access and edit the database, but then anyone who also has those edit rights can edit a record, regardless of who created it. And in iNaturalist, any of you could pick up the app and download it and create an account and take a photo and upload it, right? So it's even less restricted than GenBank, at least nominally. But what is often really cool about iNaturalist is that you might take a photo and say, I think this is an orchid, but I'm not sure what species. And then someone else who's really into orchids will come along and say, oh, it's actually like, I don't know my orchid, but like a pink lady flower orchid, right? And so they will edit the taxonomic identification on your record, even though they didn't create the observation in the first place. And so that's why there's a moderate level of rights here. Okay, so why does this matter? Why do we care whether or not people can go back and edit these records or not? And so this is where the biophysical characteristics of the pooled data resource come into place. I'm going to talk about vouchered versus unvouchered records. Sabine and I had, and Rose and I had an extended conversation about this, so this will be fun to take back to the group. This is something that is a philosophy paper that needs to be written, but has not been yet. So it's in process. What are vouchers? Material traces of the originally observed organism, again, in the species occurrence observation context. They may be physical, as in like a dead rat in a museum, or digital, right, in the sense of Bernard Dupont's photo of that javelina, that provide a scientific basis for verifying or adding new content to the recorded observation. So here is the record, right? But was this really a javelina? Someone can come back to that photo today, 14 years after Bernard Dupont took it, and say, oh, I recognize by this weird stripe, that's actually some other closely related species. It's not a javelina. And in that sense, say the taxonomic identification is incorrect, right? And so the photo is playing this role of, or epistemic role of enabling, reproducibility or new measurements of the original organism that can correct or extend the record as it stands. And you just think about this more broadly, right? In biorepository context, the vouchers might be frozen tissue that you could go back and redo a gene expression assay on, or analyze for viruses that no one had looked at before. It might be a skeleton that you can look for DNA, ancient DNA in, or do new phenotypic measurements on. It could be skin hair where you say, oh, look, there's actually little tiny dead lice on this. I'm going to use this to study parasite ecology or toxins in the organism's environment. And you can bring it to think about, oh, I was looking at the javelina, but look, there's plants in the background. What are those plants, right? Actually, this record tells me things about ecological interactions, not just that there was a javelina at that time and place, or maybe it's not a javelina at all. So this is to illustrate how vouchers play an important role coming out of a sort of collections natural history context. And let me just highlight how they're meant to be relative to a record. So let's say you've got a data resource, a full data resource that has some records in it, and you say, is this right? Could I add more here? It's a voucher if there's something upstream of that record that you can go back to and say, yes, I can check using this, and then add further justification or new content to the record. If you then had the record and something downstream was created analyzing the record, you could use this as a voucher for those downstream analyses, but we maybe come back to that if you want to. Okay, so what are the rules that these different portals put into place about vouchers? Very few of them actually require vouchers, although if you want to do research grade observations in iNaturalist, you have to have a photograph. But you can also make observations without photographs. They just won't go to GBIF, right? They won't be made available for researchers. And most of the portals permit vouchers, but GenBank doesn't allow digital vouchers. It only allows you to point to some kind of physical tissue sample or a museum specimen. And iNaturalist says, no, we don't want your dead rats. Please don't give them to us. Just your photos, please, right? Okay, so having talked about the rights of producers with respect to the data records and how there is sort of different epistemic options available to those producers, given whether or not there's a voucher available, what does this tell us about the incentives and governance that might work best for different databases? And so here we're sort of, the upshot of this is not like some grand conclusion about here's the right way to run a data portal, but more, here are some useful things to look at that give us new hypotheses to investigate. And so in particular, the availability of vouchers and the availability of editing rights to people other than the original contributors of a record, we think matter to the success of continued work in the portal. And so if you don't have vouchers, there's very little incentive to go back and edit records. Whether or not positive incentives for editing records are going to work are going to depend on both having the editing rights in place in the system and the vouchers available to work with. So here's just sort of a sequence of hypotheses kind of building on each other. Some basic ones, right? Actors have positive incentive to edit records if their existing contents or vouchers can be used to produce new information. Why? Well, because you basically can make money or make some kind of capital good resource off of the editing, You can get a grant to go back and reanalyze museum specimens. You can get a grant to add value to a genome sequence by analyzing protein coding regions, et cetera. Vouchered records, in turn, provide greater positive incentive for editing than unvouchered records. There's just not much to do with GenBank if there's no voucher. Either the DNA sequence is correct or it's incorrect. There's no way to check if they threw the sample out, right? Unless you might be able to tell that it's actually a dog, right, instead of a person. But then you can't do anything about it because you can't edit the record. Okay, here we get a little more interesting. Primary data portals with low vouchering of records assign narrower editing rights than portals with low vouchering. Oops. Should be high vouchering, sorry. So we're starting to think about how these combine together to look at patterns of rights and vouchering and the status of the portals. So GBIF is an aggregator. It combines resources from many different portals. So it's not a primary data portal. It has high vouchering, but also narrow rights. So that sort of says, okay, there's something interesting going on with aggregators that's different. When we look at primary data portals like GenBank, Symbiota portals, or iNaturalist, they're all primary data portals. If they have low vouchering, they have narrow rights with GenBank, or if they have high vouchering, then they have broad to moderate editing rights. And so this is not meant to sort of like definitively prove the hypothesis, but to indicate how you would go about checking this in other cases. So illustrative. And then you can sort of think about, all right, how are we implementing the incentives to get people to contribute to the databases? And in the case of GenBank, well, you can't publish your study unless you submit your DNA, right? That was a set of rules that came into play in the 1990s. And so it's a kind of negative payoff rule where GenBank aims to serve as authoritative repository of record. And so it gets people to contribute, not because they ever want to go back to or edit their records, or there's any incentives provided for that, but because they can't publish without it. So in contrast, both GBIF, Symbiota, and iNaturalist all have what we call positive payoff rules. GBIF really operates on prestige and credit. It looks really good if you're a small museum collection or national collection to be part of this international network of sort of prestigious researchers. And then Symbiota and iNaturalist, it's really in the community of the iNaturalist of feeling like you're part of something that matters to you intrinsically, like you care about observing and protecting the biodiversity. Or for Symbiota, you're getting NSF research grants to digitize and analyze specimens again. And so again, the check would be, right, can you find, yeah, and this one I don't have an example of, so it'd be super interesting to hear if someone thinks they have one of this. Is it in fact the case that people are contributing to GenBank because of negative incentives if they don't, and that indeed it's really the positive payoffs of contributing to these guys that's driving contributions.
If you want to have any time for a discussion.
Okay, yes, I'm there. Okay, so just this is sort of to remind you how I was breaking down these big questions. Our collective imagination often defaults to strategies for team problems, right? So part of the point of all of this is to push our imagination to be a little bit bigger and think about what are the alternatives and which of these options is really suited to the context of the problem that we're in. Many of even our go-to understandings of pluralism are either too abstract to really tell us how it works in practice, or too disjointed to really give us something more than the sum of the parts. And so I've tried to point to how better strategies are available, but haven't really been formulated, I think, because of too much entrenchment or stasis around team problems and unification. And so what are some techniques that we can get out of this, right? Well, if you want productive ambiguity, you have to make sure the context is scaffolded for people to understand each other in ambiguous settings. If you want to be able to communicate and act when dissensus is the rule, right? You have to have adequate information available to align your categories at scale. If you are trying to figure out what's going on when you're looking at the same thing literally and coming to different conclusions. The strategy we've proposed is to deepen the pluralism, to triangulate the disagreements. And then lastly, if you're trying to understand how shared resources succeed or fail in the long run, trying to understand the institutional configurations that are creating the positive or negative incentives for people to come back and contribute over and over again. All right, and with that, I'm done. Thank you.